I still have my grandmother's ring in a small velvet pouch at the bottom of my work bag. I've carried it there for 3 years. Not because I'm sentimental about jewelry. I'm not really, but because the last time I left it somewhere safe, my uncle sold it. Let me back up. My grandmother passed away in March, 2 days after my 28th birthday. She'd been in hospice for 6 weeks and I'd driven the 4 hours from Columbus to her house in rural Tennessee every single weekend to sit with her. My uncle, her son, my mother's older brother, showed up twice. Once at Christmas, once at the end. She left me the ring and a handwritten note tucked inside her Bible. It wasn't a formal will addendum, just her handwriting on a piece of lined paper she'd torn from a spiral notebook. For my Clara. She sat with me when no one else did. This ring was your grandfather's mother's. It belongs with someone who understands what things mean. The ring itself wasn't worth much in dollar terms. A small oval garnet set in yellow gold, worn thin at the band. Antique, probably 1920s, but not the kind of antique that makes an appraiser excited. Maybe $400 on a good day, but it was hers, and it was meant for me, my uncle. I'll call him what he was, a man who showed up for 2 days out of 42 and still expected the most, took the ring from the nightstand while I was downstairs making calls the morning she died. He put it in his coat pocket. I didn't notice until 3 days later. When I asked him about it, he said she promised it to his wife. He said the note was just her being sentimental, and that he'd handle the actual estate properly. He said this standing in her kitchen, eating her food, going through her cabinets. I want to tell you I confronted him right there. I didn't. I said okay and went to sit in my car for 20 minutes. That was the first mistake I let happen. There were others, but eventually I stopped letting them happen. My grandmother's house was in a small county where everyone knew everyone. She'd lived there for 53 years. She and my grandfather had built the house themselves, bought the land for almost nothing in the 70s, added on a room when my mother was born, another when my uncle came along. By the time she died, the property, about 11 acres with the house, had appreciated considerably. Rural Tennessee land near a state park, backed up to a creek, had become desirable in a way nobody expected 20 years ago. She had a will, a real one, written with an attorney in town named Mr. Beaumont, who'd handled her affairs for 15 years. I didn't know the contents. I assumed she'd split things evenly between my mother and my uncle. That seemed like what she would do. My mother had died 4 years earlier, ovarian cancer, 18 months from diagnosis to the end. My grandmother had taken that very hard. I think she felt guilty outliving her daughter, which is not a guilt any mother should have to carry, but she carried it anyway. Because my mother was gone, I assumed her share of anything would fold back into the estate somehow. Maybe go to my uncle entirely. I wasn't expecting anything. I had a decent job. I'm a physical therapist. I work with orthopedic patients. I make a reasonable living. I wasn't sitting around waiting for an inheritance. I just wanted the ring. What I did not know until 4 months after my grandmother's death was that she had changed her will 8 months before she died. The call came from Mr. Beaumont's office on a Tuesday in July. His paralegal asked if I could come in that week, that there was a matter related to my grandmother's estate that required my presence. I asked if my uncle would be there. She said she couldn't speak to that. I drove down on a Thursday. I took the day off work and drove the 4 hours alone. I told my boyfriend Seth where I was going, and he'd offered to come. I told him I'd be fine. I wanted to handle it quietly. Mr. Beaumont was in his 70s, a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and a methodical way of speaking. Like every sentence had been reviewed before it left his mouth. He thanked me for coming. He offered me water. He set a folder on the desk between us. Your grandmother updated her estate plan last August, he said. She was very deliberate about it. I want you to know that because what I'm about to show you is specific and intentional. She had put the house and the 11 acres into a living trust. The trust had 2 beneficiaries, my uncle, who received a 40% share, and me, who received 60%. She had also left me her savings, a CD account at First Community Bank in town, opened in 1987, that had been rolling over every 5 years since. I asked how much was in it. Mr. Beaumont turned a page in the folder. As of last month, he said, $114,000. I sat with that for a moment. My grandmother had been a retired school teacher. She'd lived carefully, spent carefully, never touched that account. She'd started it with $8,000 the year before my mother was born, and she'd just kept rolling it over. 36 years of compound interest on a principal she never withdrew from. She'd been growing it for someone. She'd just been waiting to know who that someone was. She added your name to the trust documentation 14 months ago, Mr. Beaumont said. After your mother's passing, she told me she wanted to make sure it went to someone who would understand what it meant to hold on to something. I thought about the note in the Bible. Someone who understands what things mean. I didn't cry in Mr. Beaumont's office. I held it together until I got to my car, and then I sat in the parking lot of a small town law office in Tennessee for a long time. I did not tell my uncle right away. This is the part I want to explain carefully because some people have opinions about it. When you grow up around someone who takes, you learn to protect what's yours before you announce you have it. That's not scheming, that's survival. I'd watched my uncle operate my whole life. I knew how he moved. He had spent the months since my grandmother's death managing the estate the way he managed everything, assuming he was in charge, assuming the outcome would favor him, not bothering to check. He'd already had conversations with a real estate agent. He'd already told his wife they'd be listing the property by fall. He had not contacted Mr. Beaumont. He had assumed the will was simple, and that simple meant equal, and that equal, with my mother gone, meant his. I had 2 weeks before the estate entered formal probate processing. I spent those 2 weeks doing exactly what Mr. Beaumont advised, making sure the trust documentation was properly recorded, making sure the CD account transfer was initiated correctly, making sure that the legal instrument my grandmother had created to protect her wishes was airtight. Seth helped me find a probate attorney in Columbus to review everything from my side. Her name was Miss Aldridge, and she was the kind of attorney who reads the entire document before speaking. She read everything. Then she looked up and said, "This is clean." Your grandmother had a good attorney. She did, she really did. I also, during those 2 weeks, went to First Community Bank. The branch manager was a woman around 50, the kind of person who'd worked in the same town for decades and knew everyone's business without making you feel exposed. Her name was on a small placard on her desk, Patricia Holt. She verified the trust documentation. She verified my ID. She looked at my grandmother's account history. 36 years of statements, a record of someone who never wavered. And then she looked at me. She came in every 5 years to roll this over, she said. Every single time. Last time was 2021. She sat right in that chair. I looked at the chair I was sitting in. She talked about you, Patricia said. Not every time, but the last 2 times. She said you were the one who called every week. I had called every week, just to check in, to hear her voice, to ask about her garden and her neighbor's dog and whatever she'd been watching on television. It hadn't seemed like a grand gesture. It had just seemed like what you do when you love someone. She knew what she was doing, Patricia said. She said it quietly, almost to herself. The transfer was initiated that day. Everything was done correctly, documented, by the book. My uncle found out on a Friday in August. He found out because Mr. Beaumont's office sent the formal probate notification to all parties, which is required by law. He received a letter outlining the trust distribution, the CD transfer, and the estate valuation. He called me at 7:14 in the morning. I have the call log, I kept it. He did not start with hello. He said, "What did you do?" I told him I hadn't done anything. I told him our grandmother had made her wishes clear and that her attorney had executed them properly. He said the will was outdated and that she hadn't been in her right mind. He said she'd promised him the property. He said I'd manipulated her during a vulnerable time. He said the phrase undue influence twice, which told me he'd either spoken to someone or Googled it in the last hour. I let him say all of it. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, I said, "If you'd like to contest the trust, you're welcome to do that. Mr. Beaumont's office can provide you with the documentation." He hung up. He did try to contest it. His attorney sent a letter within the week alleging undue influence and requesting access to my grandmother's medical records from her final year. Ms. Aldridge handled it. The challenge had no merit. My grandmother had been assessed as fully competent at the time she updated her estate plan, which Mr. Beaumont had specifically documented, and it was withdrawn within 6 weeks. It cost my uncle money he didn't recover. Here's the part I think about most. When the challenge was withdrawn and the estate was finalized, my uncle called one more time. This call was different. He wasn't angry. He sounded deflated in a way I'd never heard from him, which was disorienting because I'd only ever known him as a man who occupied space loudly. He said he didn't understand why she'd done it. I almost said, because you showed up twice, because I showed up every weekend, because she saw us both clearly. I didn't say that. What I said was, I think she wanted to make sure it went somewhere it would be cared for. He didn't respond for a long moment. Then he said, she always liked you better. He said it the way you say something that's been true for a long time and that you've refused to acknowledge until it costs you something. I said, I don't think it was about better. I think she just knew who would show up. He hung up again. We haven't spoken since. The property sold 8 months later. Once probate was fully settled, my 60% came to a number I won't share here, but it was enough to pay off my student loans entirely and still have money left. The CD transfer had already cleared. I set most of it aside. I work with patients who can't afford the follow-up care they need, and I've been thinking about what to do with some of it in that direction. I haven't figured that out yet. Seth and I moved into a house last spring. We bought it. It has a small yard with a tree in the back that I cannot identify but that blooms pink every April. My grandmother would have known what it was. She knew every plant by name. I have her ring in a velvet pouch in my work bag. I'm going to have the band restored. It's worn thin, like I said, and then I'm going to wear it. She meant for me to wear it. My uncle's wife still has the ring from the nightstand, the one he took. I decided not to pursue it. Some things are not worth what they cost to recover. I have what I was meant to have. I have what she meant for me to keep. She sat with me in that chair at First Community Bank in a way. 36 years of careful choices, a document updated 14 months after she lost her daughter, a note in a Bible in her own handwriting. She was still sitting with me. I just had to be willing to walk through the door and find out. Someone asked me once if I felt guilty. About the trust, about receiving more than my uncle, about the whole thing. I've thought about that question more than they probably expected me to. The answer is no. Not because I don't believe in fairness, but because I understand now that fairness isn't always equal. Equal would have been 50-50 regardless of who called every week, who drove 8 hours round trip on weekends, who sat in a hospital room and held her hand and talked to her about her garden and her neighbor's dog. Equal would have ignored all of that. Equal would have said presence doesn't count. My grandmother didn't believe that. She believed presence counts enormously. She spent 53 years building a life in a place where she showed up every single day, and she understood in her bones what it means to choose, consistently, to be there. She taught school for 31 years. She knew which students were coasting and which ones were doing the work. She always knew. She just waited until the end to show me she'd been keeping track all along. The garnet ring, the CD count, the 60% of 11 acres. None of it was about money. It was about someone saying, I saw you, I counted. You mattered. That's what I carry in my work bag, zipped into a small velvet pouch. Not because I'm sentimental, because some things you keep close. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually costs to show up. Not the gas money, not the 8 hours round trip on a weekend when you could have stayed home. I mean the internal cost, the choice you make over and over to be present for someone when no one's watching and no one's keeping score. Or so you think. My uncle made a calculation somewhere along the way. He decided that presence was optional, that family obligation could be fulfilled in brief appearances at significant moments, that the rest could be outsourced to people like me. And for a long time that calculation seemed to work fine for him. He had more free weekends than I did. He had less wear on his car. He sat at the comfortable end of a lot of dinners. What he didn't account for was that my grandmother was watching, not in a scheming way, not building a case against him. She wasn't that kind of person. She was just paying attention, the way people who've lived long enough always pay attention. She'd spent 31 years in a classroom reading rooms full of children, knowing which ones were doing the work and which ones were coasting. That skill doesn't leave you. She saw me. She counted. And at the end, quietly, she made sure I knew it. I think about the CD account she started in 1987. $8,000, rolled over every 5 years, never touched. That's not an accident. That's discipline, sustained over decades, pointed in a direction. She didn't know for certain who it would go to. She updated the trust only after my mother died, only after she'd seen who remained. But she'd been building towards something all along. That's what integrity looks like when it's practiced at the level of a whole life. And my uncle, I don't think he's a monster. I think he's someone who made consistently small choices that accumulated into a large outcome he didn't see coming. He didn't show up on the weekends because each individual weekend seemed minor. He took the ring because he assumed he could, because he'd always assumed he could. He expected the estate to fall his way because it always had. None of those choices felt significant in the moment. Together, they defined exactly who he was to the person who mattered. That's how it works. Not dramatically. Just quietly, over time, your choices compile into a record, and records don't lie. What I carry from all of this isn't satisfaction about the outcome, though I'd be dishonest if I said there wasn't some of that. What I carry is the understanding that the life you build through consistent, unglamorous effort is the one that holds. The calls no one sees you make. The drives no one applauds. The presence you show up with when showing up is inconvenient. My grandmother understood that. She built her whole life on it. 53 years in the same house, 31 years in the same school. A savings account she never raided because she believed in holding on to things that mattered. She passed that belief to me the only way she could. By making sure I knew she'd been paying attention. The ring is still in my work bag. The band is worn thin. I'm going to have it restored. Some things are worth keeping in good condition.